Victor Gao, thank you for joining me on UpFront. We're almost 6 months into protests that have rocked Hong Kong, and police repression seems to be escalating by the day. Just last week, a student was shot in the stomach by a police officer, while the Chinese-backed chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, declared the protesters enemies of the people. Are you okay with how China and how Chinese-backed authorities in Hong Kong have handled these protests?
No, first of all, everyone can see with his or her own eyes that violence has been committed on a massive scale. Arson attacks on police officers, attacks on public order, sabotage of transportation. All this is happening as we speak. And Hong Kong, as a democracy, protects the people's rights to protest and demonstrate, but they need to do that in a legal manner. Illegal gathering is a crime in Hong Kong, and attacks on innocent people is a crime to be punished by the law. Therefore, I think we all have great confidence in the Hong Kong SAR government, in the Hong Kong police. They have a job to do. They need to do whatever they can allow by the law to bring law and order back to Hong Kong.
Law and order, yes, but also human rights. Multiple human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have denounced the use of excessive force against the protesters. Even the UN Human Rights Chief, Michelle Bachelet, has called for an independent investigation into the violence. Presumably, you support such an investigation to clear China's good name.
Now, first of all, human rights are always important in Hong Kong as well as in any other society. However, no human rights will give any reason to anyone to commit crime or to commit violence. Therefore, let's keep these two separate.
Yes,
and
but the argument
is authorized
is that
to
the
use
Hong Kong
force.
police are using violence excessively. So do you support a UN investigation to work out what's going on the ground?
Come on, if violence of this kind, which happened in Hong Kong, happens in any other city in the world, I think the police will do their job to use whatever force necessary to restore law and order. Hong Kong police, compared with their counterparts in many other cities in the world, are very well disciplined, very civilized, if I may use that word, and I don't think they use excessive force. They are being believed as being too timid or too polite in dealing with mounting violence.
You say too
violence
timid
in Hong
and
Kong
too
is
polite.
a fact.
What about the case of Simon Cheng, a Hong Kong citizen who worked at the British consulate, was detained by the Chinese authorities without charge for 15 days. He says he was physically and mentally tortured. He was hooded. Later, he was released without charge and had to flee abroad, fearing for his own life. If that's what happens to employees of Western governments in Chinese custody, what on earth happens to ordinary Hong Kong citizens when you round them up? More than 5,000 of them have been detained since the protests began.
Have you really seen his confession? He confessed to soliciting prostitution in Shenzhen.
Hold on, wouldn't you confess to all sorts of crimes if you were hung while blindfolded, hooded, handcuffed, shackled, had your knees joints beaten with spiked batons? Wouldn't you admit to any crime?
With due respect to you, I think that gentleman committed a crime in China punishable by law. And that is a fact. And you need to talk to him about whether he committed the crime, rather than accusing China without any found reason on the television.
He says he went through this torture. You're saying he's lying?
He's lying because he confessed. His confession was now in the public domain. Everyone in the world, every news agency in the world can get direct access to his confession, acknowledging that he committed a crime in China.
Okay,
he needs to be punished, sir.
But most confessions obtained under torture don't count. Is there a risk that the Chinese military is going to directly intervene on the ground in Hong Kong? Because you have Chinese President Xi Jinping saying just a few weeks ago that, quote, anyone attempting to split China in any part of the country will end in crushed bodies and shattered bones. That's pretty stark rhetoric. Do you get why so many people are worried that there might be another Tiananmen Square massacre, but this time in Hong Kong, given such rhetoric about shattered bones?
Whatever political perspective you adopt, one thing is sure. That is, law and order need to be restored in Hong Kong. And law and order need to be restored in Hong Kong through whatever legal means possible.
Chinese military intervention?
If the Hong Kong police cannot do their job, if the Hong Kong police cannot do their job, something else needs to be done. Read the basic law, and the basic law contains provisions about how Hong Kong SAR government, if they cannot do their job in Hong Kong, need to request assistance from the central government, and the central government has a whole array of things they can do in Hong Kong.
Does that include crushing bodies and shattering bones, to quote President Xi Jinping?
Listen, and all this is completely in compliance with the one country, two system. Now, when you talk about restoring law and order, look at what the Americans are doing. Look at what the British are doing. Look at what the French people are doing. Law and order need to be restored.
We regularly do that on the show, Victor. You know that. You've been on the show before. We cover lots of topics. I'm asking about the shattering of bones and the crushing of bodies, which is the president's quote. Do you support that measure?
Sir, look at what the U.S. authorities did in Los Angeles in bringing law and order to the rioting in Los Angeles. And you will know, when you are talking about restoring law and order,
crushing of bodies and shattering of bones,
then you read history. History is very plentiful in terms of how law and order need to be restored. No civilized society will tolerate the level of violence as we see in Hong Kong. That's the bottom line.
You talk about civilized societies. Victor Gao, another major story out of China in recent days has been the leaked documents from inside the Chinese government that were published by the New York Times on the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghur Muslim minority that you and I have discussed on this show and on Head to Head before. We already knew that anywhere between 1 million and 3 million of those Muslims have been locked up in quote-unquote re-education camps. But now we know from these documents that number one, responsibility for this goes all the way to the top, to President Xi Jinping himself, who is quoted as calling for absolutely no mercy. And number two, that even some Chinese officials, Victor, were unhappy with the severity of the crackdown on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Listen, in China, the Chinese people support the government's measures in fighting against terrorism, extremism, and separatism. That's the bottom line. No one in China wants to suffer the scourge of terrorism, and we are very happy that over the past 3 years, there has been no single major terrorist attack happening in China, plaguing on the people of China, preying on innocent life. That's the key, and the Chinese people are happy about that. And terrorism is a scourge not only in China but in many other countries in the world. The world needs to be united in fighting against terrorism.
I think many countries in the world are united against what you call the scourge of terrorism, but they're not all united about the way the Chinese have decided to deal with millions of people, literally. And in fact, as we learn from these documents, many Chinese officials had issues with this too. Wang Yongzhi, the Chinese official in charge of one of the counties in Xinjiang, where tens of thousands of Uyghurs were detained, he thought that the orders from central government, according to the New York Times, quote, left no room for moderation and would poison ethnic relations in the country. He ended up freeing over 7,000 inmates, and for that he was detained, stripped of power, and prosecuted.
Sir, with due respect to you, let me suggest, let the Chinese fight against terrorism in China. Let the Americans fight terrorism in America.
This was a Communist Party official running a county in Xinjiang who freed Uyghurs and was punished for doing so.
Listen, let China fight its terrorism in its own term. Don't let the Americans fight the terrorism in China with their terms.
Well, last time I checked, Wang Yongzhi is not a U.S.
citizen. Do its job and fight terrorism in their own country.
Who we learned this week quietly ordered the release of more than 7,000 Uyghurs because he thought it was an excessive policy. He was detained, stripped of power, and prosecuted. Do you support that move against your fellow Chinese citizen?
With due respect, let's focus on the main thing, that is fighting against terrorism in China. We need to fight against terrorism in China.
So you're very
terrorism is a scourge.
I've asked you a specific question. Why was a Chinese Communist Party official relieved of his job and punished for freeing Uyghurs if everyone's united against fighting terrorism?
Sir, I will mention this 1,000 times it is necessary. The Chinese people have a job to do, that is to fight against terrorism.
Okay,
I hope you will understand that.
I understand. You say they're all terrorists and this is a security measure. But the Chinese government in these leaked documents makes clear that officials were well aware that those locked up in Xinjiang weren't guilty of any crimes. This is the quote, "It is just that their thinking has been infected by unhealthy thoughts." So you're locking up people for not committing a crime, for having thoughts you don't like. That's pretty Orwellian, Victor Gao.
No, I think there are 23 million people in Xinjiang, And I can say with all responsibility that the majority of those people want to have peace from terrorism. And they are united behind the government's measures of fighting against terrorism. Because, why? None of them want to suffer the evil forces of terrorism. That's the bottom line. Again, I will repeat this 1,000 times. Let's focus on the daunting overriding task of fighting against terrorism. That's the main point.
Fine. You say it's the main point. For people who are being tortured, it might not be the main point. How long can the Chinese government carry on pretending that hundreds and hundreds of Uyghurs around the world who were either detained and tortured themselves and have escaped, or have family members back home who have disappeared or been tortured? How long can it continue to pretend that all of these Uyghurs around the world who are raising the alarm bell, who are sounding the alarm bell, that they're all lying to human rights groups, they're all lying to journalists, they're all making it up? How long can you pretend that?
Sir, let's fight against terrorism, and terrorism committed by whatever person need to be punished. I think in China we do not discriminate against minorities.
You support pulling fingernails out, Victor Gao. You support electric shocks. You support people being sterilized. You support people being electrocuted, having their heads shaved. This is the testimony from Uyghurs who have escaped Xinjiang province.
Listen, I support all the legal measures adopted by the Chinese government under Chinese law in order to fight against terrorism. That's the bottom line.
Does the Chinese government's legal measures in Xinjiang include pulling out fingernails, electric shocks, the shaving of heads, a chair of nails, sterilization? Is that what you support, the Chinese legal measures in Xinjiang?
Sir, you are asking misleading questions.
No, I'm not. I'm asking you about the testimony
of Uyghurs. Into your trap.
There's no trap, Victor. I'm literally reading out the quotes from Sairal Sotbai, a Uyghur Muslim teacher who escaped from China, from Zumrat Daoud, who testified in Washington, D.C. this week, from Khairat Samakan, who says that he was forced to stand in a fixed position for 12 hours. These are fellow Chinese citizens of yours giving their testimony on what happened to them. Are you not concerned?
Sir, there are more than 50 countries, governments, who signed a written statement in support of China's fight against terrorism in Xinjiang. Why don't you read their statements? Why don't you talk to them? Why don't you talk to the Chinese government officials in China doing the very, very important job of fighting against terrorism? Why do you want to pick one side against the majority of the people in China? Why don't you talk to people like me who do not want to suffer the consequences of terrorism in China?
Well,
let's be
Victor, hold on.
Very balanced in your view.
I am talking to you. In fact, we've invited you on the show because we appreciate you coming on.
But don't impose your questions on me.
Well, I'm not imposing a question. I'm asking a question.
But don't impose your misleading questions to me.
You think it's misleading, Victor. I'm literally reading out the quotes from Chinese citizens. And, you know, we've asked Chinese government officials to come on the show. They've refused to come on. So
how many people have you talked about? How many people have you talked about? Have you talked to about 1.4 billion Chinese people? Have you talked to the majority of the people here in China?
You want me to quote 1.4 billion people to you? I'm quoting to you people who say they've been tortured. If that doesn't bother you, that's your choice. Last question then. According to the New York Times, the leaked documents...
That's not my choice. That's the choice of more than 50 countries in the world.
Fine.
They support China's policy.
That's fine. That's a legitimate point, and you are right. Many countries do support China's policy. That doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean I'm not going to ask you any questions. A final question, though, Victor. Appreciate you taking time out. According to the New York Times, the leaked documents also show that the government has plans to extend restrictions on Islam to other parts of China. Mosques have already been demolished or shut down in multiple provinces. There's been a crackdown on the use of Arabic script in public places. One China scholar recently said that the People's Republic of China has become the world's foremost purveyor of anti-Islamic ideology and hate. What do you say to them?
That's completely false. I travel extensively throughout China. I have many friends who are Muslims. Islam is a great religion, and we all need to respect Islam. Go to Ningxia, go to many parts in Xinjiang, go and see with your own eyes how many mosques are elegantly standing there in front of the people, in front of the believers and non-believers. If anyone believes that China will damage or do ruins to the mosques, they are cheating themselves. They are cheating the whole world, and the truth will be more eloquent than these lies.
Victor Gao, thank you for joining me on UpFront.